Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and this program on why Latina history matters to U.S. history, which is the inaugural lecture in a year-long series organized by the National Women's History Museum and the U.S. Studies program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center on the past, present, and future of U.S. women's history. The series will look at various topics in women's history, exploring leading scholarship in the field, and will address the question of why women's history. And of course, our major speaker today is Professor Vicki Ruiz of the University of California at Irvine. I'm Philippa Strum, the former director of the Division of U.S. Studies and now a senior scholar here at the center, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today and to moderate this program. Before I introduce a representative from the National Women's History Museum to say a word or two about that wonderful institution, which will soon, we hope, have a home, I want to say just a word about the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars for those of you who are here for the first time. I know some of you know about the center. It's delightful to see you here again, but some of you don't know. And I'm pretty proud of the Woodrow Wilson Center for the very good reason that when Congress decided it wanted to create a monument to Woodrow Wilson, who remains the only president to earn a PhD, so he combined scholarship and policymaking in his persona, Congress decided instead of putting yet another building up on the mall or somewhere nearby, that it would create a living monument to Wilson. And pulling together those two strains of his life, the politician strain, the scholar strain, Congress decided to create a home where scholars and policymakers could come to talk in a neutral setting about matters of importance to both. The center runs over 700 programs like this one a year. Some of them last an hour, some of them last a couple of days, but all of them are devoted to exploring the world of ideas and relating them to what's actually happening out there in the very real world. So looking at Latinas is very much in keeping with that mission. And so is welcoming the National Women's History Museum, which, as I said, will soon be the latest addition to the physical structures of Washington and is already an addition in cyberspace, and a rather wonderful one at that. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to one of the board members of the Women's History Museum, Susan Scanlon.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Scanlon, a member of the board of the National Women's History Museum. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first full season of its new lecture series, The Past, Present, and Future of U.S. Women's History. Our president, Joan Wages, sends her sincere regrets. Joan is otherwise occupied this afternoon. She's on the mall with the museum's spokesperson, Meryl Streep, former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice, Congresswomen Carolyn Maloney and Eleanor Holmes Norton, and a few White House first daughters, having her picture taken by Annie Leibovitz for the cover of Vogue magazine. There'll be a lot of history gathered in one frame. We are honored and delighted that the museum's opening lecture will be presented by Dr. Vicki Ruiz, Dean of the School of Humanities and Professor of History and Chicano Latino Studies at the University of California at Irvine. Thank you for sharing your vision with us, Dr. Ruiz. And thanks also to the Woodrow Wilson Center for providing this wonderful space for us to gather and learn. And the museum the timing is perfect. October is National Hispanic Heritage Month, and the museum has just launched a new online exhibit, Latinas in the New World, focusing on a 5-state look at the way that women of Hispanic heritage have helped shape the direction of American culture and contemporary life. From their first venture into Florida, Latinas played their part in creating this nation. That was in 1513, by the way, about a century prior to the first Anglo woman's arrival. We invite you to visit our website and tour the exhibit. It's at www.nwhm.org/online-exhibits/Latina. On a personal note, my grandmother, mother, sister, and I were all born and raised in Washington, D.C. It makes me a third-generation Washingtonian, pretty much of a rare fish. School field trips introduced me to George Washington's house, Robert E. Lee's horse, and Charles Lindbergh's plane. The unspoken message of these educational expeditions: girls grow up to keep the home fires burning while sending their men off to make history. Where were Susan B. Anthony and Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt to show me that I could be bold and brassy and brave? Where are Sally Ride and Dorothy Height and Dolores Huerta to show my daughters that they can make a difference? Since 1995, we've been working to establish a spot on the National Mall where girls can bring their brothers and both can be inspired by and to greatness. From 9 to 5, and usually later, I chair the National Council of Women's Organizations. That's a coalition of 240 progressive women's groups representing 12 million American women. Our point of view ranges from Girls Inc. to the Older Women's League and every age in between. I'm here with a message from each and every one of the Council's 12 million members. We want the country and the Congress to recognize the historic work our foremothers did and that their great-granddaughters will do to build America. And we hope that all of you will roll up your sleeves and help us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. We were kind of hoping you would bring Meryl Streep along, but, can't have everything. I neglected to ask all of you if you have cell phones to please turn them off, or any other kind of devices that make loud noises and which would interfere with the webcasting of this program. I want to second what Susan said about not learning about women. I didn't grow up in Washington. I grew up in Brooklyn. But in Brooklyn, going to the Brooklyn public schools, I learned that there were no women in the United States of any importance in between Betsy Ross and Eleanor Roosevelt. And there were no women of any importance since. So, and of course, we didn't learn anything about Latina history. That was absolutely unspoken. Not only were all of the faces in American history male, they were all white. Well, a couple of years ago, as Vicki knows, because she was wonderful about helping me with this, I decided to write a book about a Mexican-American school desegregation case. And in doing the research for that, I had to give myself a crash course in Mexican-American history. And what did I discover to my wonderment? First of all, that there was Mexican-American history. Wow, coming from Brooklyn, I didn't know that. And second of all, that women were such an important part of it. I thought I knew labor history in the United States. I didn't know about the extraordinary efforts of Mexican-American women in labor history, not only their efforts, but their successes. I didn't know so much, and my assumption is that there are other people out there who know quite as little. Well, into this enormous gap comes Vicki Ruiz. Thank goodness for Vicki. Vicki is the Dean of School of Humanities and Professor of History and Chicano Latino Studies, as you've heard, at UC Irvine. She is the author, co-author, editor, co-editor of 17 books, and I'm not going to give you the whole rundown of them, but I just want you to understand that this is the woman, more than anybody else, as far as I'm concerned, who has made Latina history known to all kinds of people who would otherwise not know anything about it. The 10th edition of her book, From Out of the Shadows, Mexican women, in the 20th century America, came out in 2008. She's got another wonderful book that talks about women in the labor movement, Cannery Women, Cannery Lives. She's the co-editor of a women's history reader called Unequal Sisters. And now she's become the sole editor of the 4th edition of that book. So the books keep getting reproduced. You understand this says something about the enormous quality of them. She's the co-author of a U.S. history textbook called Created Equal, a social and political history of the U.S., which means that it's a lot different from the kind of history I learned in Brooklyn and that you learned here in Washington, and the co-editor of the 3-volume Latinos in the United States, a historical encyclopedia. So when I say Vicki's been really important to the field, I'm not exaggerating at all. What we're going to do is ask Vicki to speak for about 45 minutes. Then we're going to turn the microphones over to you for a Q&A session, and that will be followed by a small reception outside. So please join me in welcoming Vicki Ruiz.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that very generous and warm introduction. I really appreciate it. Oh, who are Latinos? And why do their stories matter? Latinos represent the largest minority population in the United States. They're a diverse mosaic of cultural background, generation, and historical experience. Now, what does the term Latino mean? Well, it refers to all people of Latin American birth or heritage who live in the United States, from Hispanos in New Mexico who can trace their heritage back about 7 generations, to recent arrivals from Guatemala. However, and I should point out, there's never been a single mutually agreed upon ethnic label. That is when what Spanish-speaking people agree on what to call themselves. If you're in 1830 and you lived in California, you'd be Californio. You lived in New Mexico, you'd be Hispano. And of course, if you lived in Texas, you're Tejano. Latino and Hispanic are certainly sort of the most expansive, encompassing terms. But many prefer nationality-based identities, such as Mexican or Mexican-American, Puerto Riqueño, Cubano. Others, as I said, prefer a regional identification. Tejano is very popular in Texas, while in New Mexico and Colorado, Hispano or Hispanic is the preferred term. Now there are over 50 million Latinos, according to the latest census. 63% are Mexican, 9% Puerto Rican, and 3.5% Cuban. They represent about 3/4 of this growing population. Moreover, these 3 ethnicities have long histories in the United States. For Mexicans, it's the Southwest and the Pacific Coast, and for other Latinos in Florida and the Atlantic seaboard. Now, it's important to understand these histories within and beyond the borders of the United States and to contextualize our present and projected demographic realities with the past that preceded them. A recent National Council of Research study predicts by 2030, 1/4 of all Americans will be of Latin American birth or heritage. Now, when people say, well, it's immigration, well, not so much the driving factor. Well, it's the high birth rate. That's not so much the driving factor either. Actually, it's intermarriage. When George Lopez in his HBO special said, Latinos, we marry everybody, is really one of the, certainly a driving force for this increase. Now, since the founding of St. Augustine in 1565, Spanish-speaking peoples have left their imprints on soil that would become the United States, appearing on the landscape before the establishment of French and European settlements. Many Latinos have Native American roots, while some trace their heritage to the rich contributions of people from West Africa, among whom most were brought to these shores as enslaved men and women. Still others descended from Spain and diverse European countries, and in time combined their particular experiences with different communities of people in the Americas in the process of mestizaje, the blending of Spanish, African, and indigenous heritage. As poet Aurora Levins Morales has aptly surmised, I am new. History made me. My first language was Spanglish. I was born at the crossroads, and I am whole. Despite a fluorescence of scholarship on the Spanish borderlands in the last 20 years, works that bring to life communities such as Santa Fe, founded in 1610, historians frequently give the region and the era no more than a passing glance. One reason for this erasure is simply structural in nature. Excuse me. Having finite time and space to devote to the colonial era, teachers and textbooks place an understandable emphasis on the 13 British colonists as the foreground to the American Revolution. But such logic should not preclude discussions of other European settlers, notably the Spanish, who arrived in St. Augustine 4 decades before the founding of Jamestown. Another explanation echoes back to the Black legend. With roots in the Reformation and in the competition for New World empires, the Black legend counterposed virtuous English settlers against rapacious Spanish conquistadores. In a New York Times editorial, best-selling author Tony Horwitz reflected on the ways in which the Black legend continues to cast a shadow over America's Spanish past. Connecting history to current events, he poignantly observes, quote, "The national amnesia isn't new, but it's glaring and supremely paradoxical at a moment when politicians warn of the threat posed to our culture and identity by an invasion of immigrants from across the Mexican border. If Americans hit the books, they'd find what Al Gore called an inconvenient truth. The early history of what is now the United States was Spanish, not English, and our denial of this heritage is rooted in age-old stereotypes that still entangle today's immigration debate." Now, whether carving out a community in St. Augustine in the 16th century, to reflecting on colonialism and liberty in the 19th century, to fighting for civil rights in the courts through the 20th century, Spanish-speaking people made history both within and beyond national borders. Certainly, one talk today, and not in 45 minutes, can I begin to convey comprehensively the legacies of individuals of Latin American origins. So I'm going to give you sort of a panoramic state of the field, and I'm going to focus on 3 historical moments that are pivotal to reimagining an American narrative with Latinos at the center. These historical moments are 1848, 1898, and 1948. So let's begin with 1848. With the conclusion of the U.S.-Mexican War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848 marked the end of the Spanish-Mexican frontier era, an era that still remains shrouded in myth and misconception. For example, the idea of popular pre-statehood California, controlled by fun-loving, swashbuckling rancheros, you know the Zorro myth, Zorro is fiction. It was also enshrined in an earlier historiography, of Moonlight Amantillas. I mean, you see all of these sort of local California historians who sort of preserve this in the late 1800s, early 1900s, about this sort of golden era of a Spanish past, where fiestas and fandangos were the order of the day. However, how many people actually own those large land ranches and could live that sort of ranchero lifestyle? Well, historian Douglas Monroy has in his book, Thrown Among Strangers, in his demographic analysis, figures that only about 3% of California's Spanish-speaking population actually live that lifestyle. I live in Orange County. It's like, everyone in Orange County lives like the OC or the Real Housewives. Really tiny. Now, typically, people did not preside over sprawling ranches. Rather, they tended to small family farms. Late 19th century historian Hubert Howe Bancroft, from the Bancroft Library in Berkeley is named, described women's labor in the following manner. They had charge of the kitchen and of the sewing, which was by no means a light task. Many families made the bread, candles, and soap consumed by the family, and many took charge of sowing and harvesting the crops. Indeed, according to Ranchero, the entire family lived, where the entire family woke at 3 o'clock, and men and women worked until dusk. And that's how he described sort of the typical lifestyle in California. Now, what does contemporary scholarship reveal about the people who journeyed north to regions that would become the American Southwest? Establishing communities, Santa Fe in 1610, San Antonio in 1781, and Los Angeles San Antonio 1718, and let me reverse that, Los Angeles in 1781. Well, they represented a mixed lot of colonial castas that demarcated to the nth degree Spanish, African, and indigenous ancestries. For example, over 1/2 of the founding families in Los Angeles were of African heritage. In addition to mixed-race settlers born in Mexico, Jews from the Iberian Peninsula sought refuge from the Inquisition in the far-flung province of New Mexico. Combing an array of colonial documents, including baptismal records, historian Omar Valerio Jimenez calculated the dynamics of economic mobility in determining racial identification for Spanish-speaking settlers in South Texas. And what he found out, he comes up with this idea of pigmentocracy, okay? Individual examples abound of porfecinos, that's neighbors, whitening their caste or their wealth as their wealth increased. Okay, the idea that money buys color in colonial Latin America, that's kind of like a doxa, and you certainly see it in the Southwest. Particularly successful individuals not only entered an elite class, but they recreated themselves as Españoles. Now, inventing or reinventing oneself, isn't that the hallmark of the mythic American frontier? Before we enshrine these settlers as a part of the pantheon of Western lore, the rugged individuals who trekked into the wilderness in search of opportunity, it's crucial to remember that the Spanish borderlands encompassed caste-based communities, with bonded labor at the center of social and economic relations. Indentured servitude was prominent on the colonial frontier and persisted well into the 19th century. With Indians, and to a lesser extent, people of African heritage, pressed into bondage. About 20 years ago, I was doing some research on Russell Lee, who was sort of like the Dorothea Lange of Texas, and I was at the Barker History Center at UT Austin. And I was waiting a long time for these photos. And I thought to myself, I can either read the latest issue of Texas Monthly that was there on the shelf, or I could go through the Bahar archives. I'm a 20th century historian. I have about as much business looking at 17th century documents as though if I were an ancient historian. But I saw this case. It said, Bahar archives, mulatto woman child custody case. Oh, I've got to order it. Okay, the photo stayed on the shelf, believe me, for several hours while I read and then translated this incredible case. In 1735, Antonia Luscardia Hernandez, who describes herself as a free mulatta, sued her former master for custody of their son. In her words, I suffered so much from lack of clothing and mistreatment of my humble person. He, the patron, exercising absolute power, snatched away from me my son, the only man I have and the one whom I hope will eventually support me. Admitting paternity, the man claimed that his former servant had relinquished the child to his wife. The court, however, remanded custody of the child to Hernandez on the condition that she provide him, quote, a proper home. It's a wonderful document. I wish I had more time to sort of go in the document, but I looked afterwards, trying to find them, see if they showed up again, and they sort of disappear from the historical record. Studying the contours of power and stratification through the interplay of gender, caste, race, and culture is the intellectual gift of Ramon Gutierrez in his book, When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away. He describes in intimate detail the lives of captive Indians pressed into bondage as children at the hands of New Mexican colonists. After serving their time, these janiceros, or people without moorings to either indigenous or Hispanic societies, created their own communities, separate physically and socially. With imagination and statistical precision, Gutierrez talks about sort of the relations of power and the importance of marriage in colonial New Mexico, how marriages influenced by the environment and the economy created an ever-changing society predicated on notions of honor, shame, and conquest. Now, in Gutierrez's books, there's only two groups of people in New Mexico. They're the Hispanos and the Pueblos. Well, James Brooks comes along, and in his award-winning Captives and Cousins, he's going, that's too rigid a model. He argues that a greater fluidity of racial locations within what he calls intricate borderland communities of interest, rooted in slavery. He teases out the possibilities through which captives became cousins across Hispano settlements and surrounding native nations, including the Comanche, the Apache, and the Navajo. But Yale historian Ned Blackhawk adds a cautionary tone in his review of Captives and Cousins, quote, forged amid the maelstrom of colonial diseases, warfare, guns, horses, and economic dependency, captivity in the Southwest may have created webs and bridges between peoples, but it did so on the backs of young Indian women and children. So it's okay, before we get this idea that there's these happy trading going on, we need to, put that in perspective. Indeed, borderland scholars have provided compelling narratives of societies rife with conflict and accommodation, pain and possibilities, effectively destabilizing the earlier notion, whether it's from early California historians or from early Chicano historians who saw it as sort of this peaceful pastoral era, sort of this golden age where everyone got along. Not so. With the conclusion of the U.S.-Mexican War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Spanish-speaking settlers would confront dramatic changes in their communities. If one considers Texas in the accounting, Mexico lost 1/2 of its national domain and between 75 to 80,000 of its citizen colonists, the majority residing in New Mexico. Yet these narratives of these frontier settlers remain hidden within the American experience, overshadowed by the national implications of conquest, referred to in one still on the market U.S. history textbook as the, quote, fruits of victory. Historians generally focus on the U.S.-Mexican War as, quote, the fire bell in the night, with the subsequent acquisition, not conquest, of new lands. Of course, a feat that would open up the incendiary issue of slavery in the territories. With the exception of the California Gold Rush, survey texts turn eastward to chronicle the path to civil war. But what happened to those Spanish-speaking settlers who remained in the Southwest? Ostensibly citizens after a period of 1 year. That's what the treaty states. However, simply put, Mexicans on the U.S. side of the border became second-class citizens, commonly divested of their property, political power, and cultural entitlements. Of course, as you can imagine, this transformation did not occur in a dispassionate atmosphere, as violence and vigilante action became commonplace. Taking a long view of marshaling a wealth of quantitative data, I'm so happy for his work because we don't have to go through the tables. Stanford professor Albert Camarillo, in his book Chicanos in a Changing Society, documented labor market segmentation, intergenerational economic stratification, and what he calls barrioization or segregation, the colonial legacies of manifest destiny. He posits that the patterns of racial and occupational segregation in 19th century California would frame the lives of Mexicans, both natives and newcomers, well into early decades of the 20th century. California elites were fully conscious of their shifting fortunes as they sought to preserve their property and status through familial and business alliances with newly arrived Euro-American entrepreneurs and professionals. And we have in our audience, I know, Dr. Margie Brown Coronel, who just finished her dissertation on the Del Valle family in Rancho Cumulos. Rancho Cumulos was the model for Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona. And certainly her dissertation is just filled with all of these type of business and social networks as people struggle to maintain their land and their cultural entitlements. Now, Maria Amparo Rista Burton, who's considered the first Spanish-Mexican woman writer to publish in the United States, would prove an astute chronicler of this general state of declension in her 1885 novel, The Squatter and the Don. But as early as 1859, she made the following lament in a letter to a distant cousin. It cannot be denied that the Californians have reason to know it. The Americans must know it. Boasted liberty and equality of rights seems to stop when it meets a Californian. And now we have to beg for once we have the right to demand. Now, there are a number of new scholarly works talking about the ways in which Spanish-Mexican women sort of reconnoitered their realms. There's Maria Raquel Casas' monograph, Daughter of the Land, where she gives a fascinating exploration of the definitions of race, privilege, and social position. She does it through the story of an Hispanicized woman, Indian woman, Victoria Reed, who crossed class and color lines more than once in her lifetime. She is an indigenous woman at the mission at San Gabriel. She marries the Scottish merchant Hugo Reed. He does very well for a time, and she becomes described as the Rose of Castile. She really becomes transformed. However, when Hugo Reed's business fortunes decline and he dies, she basically dies a very impoverished Indian woman. In Negotiating Conquest, Miroslava Chavez Garcia records how Mexican women availed themselves of the U.S. legal system. Women used the courts to hold on to their land, to rid themselves of abusive husbands, and to gain monetary support for their children. Now, concurrent with the economic, political, and cultural upheavals occurring in the Southwest, many Cuban exiles on the East Coast embraced manifest destiny. So, Rodrigo Lasso, in his stunning literary history, looks at the publications of Cuban expatriates from the 1840s to the 1860s. Who knew there were Spanish-language newspapers? Where thriving print culture was based in New York and New Orleans, and encouraged the United States to set its sights on Cuba. Look what you did in Mexico, can you kind of turn your attention south? These writers fashioned themselves as emissaries of liberation who believed that Spanish colonialism should be supplanted by American annexation. In Reign to Cuba, Lasso teased out the contradictions among Latin American intellectuals who coveted American ideals of freedom while they acknowledged antebellum slavery and U.S. imperial designs. However, internal debates really began to fracture these groups of intellectuals, including the founding of an abolitionist newspaper, El Mulatto. Now, Emilia Casanova de Villaverde would represent exiles whose views would more closely aligned with a younger and more famous compatriot, José Martí. During the 10 Years' War between 1868 and 1878, Casanova de Villaverde, in a letter to Italian freedom fighter Giuseppe Garibaldi, asserted, quote, that the beginning of our revolution means the freedom of our slaves, giving them arms and incorporating them into our patriotic ranks. Like the Grimsky sisters, Emilia Casanova de Villaverde turned away from the privileges of the family plantation and advocated for abolition. Only recently have historians acknowledged her role as an early leader in the quest for Cuban independence, a rebel in her own right, separate from her husband. 1898. While 1848 would burn in the consciousness of Mexican Americans during the decades that followed, and of Chicano activists over a century later, 1898 would symbolize a similar transhistoric threshold for Cubans and Puerto Ricans. The Filipino-Cuban Spanish-American War, you got to get all the players in there, has roots both in the jingoistic stories published by the Hearst Press and also protection of U.S. business interest in Cuba that was at the time estimated at $50 million. However, historians have been slow to acknowledge the activities of Cubans and Puerto Ricans in the United States who vigorously championed the cause of independence from Spain. With New York City as its primary base, José Martí established the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892. And within a short span, over 40 branches appeared in New York, New Orleans, Key West, Ybor City. On January 29, 1895, Martí was one of 4 insurgents to sign a declaration of war. The 1895 war had begun. Though he would fall in battle early on in the campaign, Martí's deeds, poetry, and essays would assume a life of their own. Revered as an apostle of Cuban liberation, Martí left multiple legacies extending into the 21st century. It's one of the few things that a Cuban exile in Calle Ocho and a resident of Havana can really agree upon, is the importance of José Martí. Within the last decade, many scholars in Latin America and American studies have looked to José Martí for inspiration, interrogating the meanings inscribed in his essay, Nuestra América, or Our America, in which he laid out a hemispheric vision of independent nation-states in a concerted dialogue with their powerful neighbor to the north. Perhaps portending a century of U.S. intervention in Latin America, Martí expressed the following sentiments. The pressing needs of our America is to show itself as it is, one in spirit and intent. The scorn of our formidable neighbor who does not know us is our America's greatest danger. And since the day of the visit is near, it's imperative that our neighbor know us, and soon. Through ignorance, it might even come to lay hands on us. Once it does know us, it will remove its hands out of respect. One must have faith in the best of men and distrust the worst. Now, on the one hand, Nuestra America has become sort of a symbol of a truly transnational, hemispheric, interdisciplinary dialogue. But on the other, Martí as a person must be placed within historical moment in the United States. Martí represents an intellectual tradition of U.S.-based Latin American thought in exile that really assumes silence and invisibility. In fact, Rodrigo Lasso has sort of gone even earlier than the 1840s and is now writing a book on the Spanish language press in Philadelphia during the days of the early Republic. So I'm really excited to learn more about his work as he brings it to fruition. Now, Martí's contemporaries, men and women who had worked tirelessly toward Cuban and Puerto Rican liberation, would find their hopes dashed by war's end. Although Cuba would gain its independence in 1902 with the caveat of the Platt Amendment, Puerto Rico would remain a U.S. dominion as a, quote, non-incorporated territory. Are we brothers and our property territory? Or are we bondsmen of war and our islands a crown colony? That was a pointed question directed to the U.S. Congress by a delegation from Puerto Rico in 1900. Economic dependency on the United States would significantly reclass the lives of Puerto Ricans and Cubans in the decades ahead. Although there were certainly benefits to annexation, innovations in sanitation, transportation, internal improvement, schools, medical care, The economic restructuring that occurred in Puerto Rico with U.S. capital investment in sugar, large corporate landholdings, and the decline of coffee resulted in a massive dislocation of the island's rural folk. Ignoring the impact of American business interests, federal policymakers tend to interpret random unemployment as rooted in overpopulation. As a result, they devise plans to disperse families away from the island through job recruitment and outright contract labor. For example, in 1900, over 5,000 Puerto Ricans arrived in Hawaii to harvest sugarcane, filling a labor shortage caused by the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And for more than 2 decades, families would follow. What a great gig, studying Puerto Ricans in Hawaii. As a great research gig. I know a couple of scholars who actually do it, and Maui, in fact, has this huge Puerto Rican Historical Association. Now, by 1917, with the passage of the Jones Act, Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens. Yet for many, the free exercise of their rights proved elusive. Unlike cigar rollers in Florida, who exerted some control over their labor, Puerto Rican sugar workers in Hawaii found their movement so restricted that they could not move from one plantation to another without the planters' consent. By 1920, Puerto Ricans had migrated as contract workers or as free agents to 45 of the 48 states, creating communities in such distant locales as Louisiana and Arizona. However, as historian Virginia Sanchez-Coral revealed, over 60% called New York City home. Indeed, the centrality of New York as a Puerto Rican destination would resonate in the descriptor given to children born on the island, Nuyorican, regardless of actual place of birth. You could be born in Phoenix, you could be born in Chicago, and you're still a Nuyorican. Luisa Capetillo, the passionate Puerto Rican labor leader and feminist, certainly found New York a hospitable place during her brief residence. She was a veteran organizer in Puerto Rico and Florida, and she used her position as a lectora, or reader, to cultivate and reinforce the consciousness of cigar rollers on trade union issues, socialism, anarchism, and at times women's rights. She was, by the way, expelled from Cuba for wearing pants. They saw it as an idea. She wore a men's outfit, pants, the fedora, everything, and Cuban authorities, sort of deported her for, improper female conduct. Now, in New York, she wasn't an organizer. In New York, she ran a boarding house, an adjoining restaurant, dishing up revolution and vegetarian fare. In her feminist manifesto published in 1911, Capetillo stressed a radical version of Republican motherhood, emphasizing women's education for their own sake and for the sake of their children. Envisioning of a future in which women were emancipated in every respect, Capetillo declared, "Women are capable of everything and anything." Now, the Spanish-speaking workers of Ybor City had welcomed both José Marti and Luisa Capetillo. Now, since 1886, Cuban, Spanish, and Puerto Rican cigar rollers and their Italian counterparts created thriving militant work cultures in addition to extensive ethnic community networks. In 1892, when José Marti had traveled there to seek support for the Cuban Revolutionary Party, Paulina and Roberto Pedroso, Afro-Cuban community activists, offered their boarding house as his headquarters. During the 1895 war, Cubans of all colors contributed their wages, savings, and jewelry for the sake of independence. Such solidarity, however, would be fleeting. Bridging the 19th and 20th century, Nancy Hewitt, in her book, talks about the racial, on women's activism in Papa, the racial and generational cleavages that surfaced within Latino neighborhoods in Ybor City. Now, constructions of race would influence ethnic identification among the children of Cuban immigrants. While these Spanish-speaking immigrants of varying complexions came together and built ethnic community networks, trade unions, political groups, their children's sense of themselves became predicated on their own racial location in the Jim Crow South, where, not surprisingly, Afro-Cubans developed a greater affiliation and kinship with African Americans. Afro-Latinos across generation and region confronted the color line at every turn. Linda Delgado, in her wonderful profile of beloved journalist and civil rights leader Jesus Galón, offered insight into the complexities of racial location within New York's Puerto Rican communities. Quote, "Unlike Arthur Schomburg, Colón saw himself as a Puerto Rican man who happened to be black, while Schomburg identified as a black man who happened to be Puerto Rican." Now, moving from the grassroots to the transnational, Nancy Borabel, talks about the political import of phenotype among Cubans. Early exile and migrant, annexationist, separatist, and independence movements use negotiating meanings attached to blackness, whiteness, and in-betweenness to define and build a nation. I would add that these imprints of these negotiations can be traced across the entire canvas of Latino history, from the borderlands to the present. Now, the first modern wave of Mexican immigration to the United States began at the turn of the 20th century. Most demographers, depending on who you believe, the number of sort of Mexican-American or Spanish-American citizens in 1900 were between 300,000 to 500,000 people. By 1930, this figure would increase dramatically, as over 1 million Mexicans, single men, women, and children, were pushed out by the revolution and pulled in by prospective jobs in the United States. Now we have this sort of push-pull model, okay? The idea that job opportunities, you know, the Colorado Desert becomes the Imperial Valley due to the engineering feats of George Chafee. There's the growth of commercialized agriculture. There's railroads. There's mining. And so it's pulling people in. And the idea of the Mexican Revolution, in particular, is pushing people out. In fact, estimated as many people who came to the United States also perished during the Mexican Revolution, over 1 million people. Gilbert Gonzalez, my colleague at UCI, in his book Culture of Empire, said, well, not so fast. In his mind, he believes that there was actually the start of this migration, of this immigration, well before 1910, as the result of Porfirio Diaz's plans to modernize Mexico by opening up the country to large-scale foreign investment, particularly in agriculture. He argues that if you just use push-pull, that it really ignores sort of the fluidity of the transnational migration, that it just intensified after 1910. I don't know if he really said this, but Porfirio Diaz, if he did, it's a statement of extreme irony, because he is credited with the statement, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." However, he is the one who opened, as I said, to foreign investment. Now, instead of manifest destiny as a territorial conquest that culminated in the U.S.-Mexican War, manifest destiny as economic empire building retained certainly considerable currency. Now let's talk about 1948. Okay. Many of you are familiar with the Ken Burns, the controversy, perhaps, of the war. You know, there were no Latinos in his series segment. Why were Latinos so upset? You're wondering. So they weren't included. Why are they upset? Well, when you consider that approximately 500,000 Latinos served in World War II, and this figure does not include the tens of thousands who labored in defense plants and other industries in the war effort, such as food processing, you can kind of understand. And particularly when most demographers placed the Latino population in the United States in 1940 at 1.5 million. So if you're thinking, it's almost every sort of able-bodied man, was really served in World War II. So you can see it's a touchy issue. It's one of the few issues I've seen where Mecha students at university campus are upset about it, but also the American GI Forum is very upset about it. And it was this, as I said, unifying issue. Now, the impact of the war on Latino political consciousness has been the subject of much scholarly debate. Was World War II a catalyst for civil rights among Latinos in the United States? Lorena Oropesa says that their battlefield exploits would brace Mexican Americans for their fight at home, but however, George Sanchez said that actually political education of the second generation had actually began before anybody donned a military uniform. And this is made by a historian, obviously a very young man who has never served in the military, or perhaps never had anyone serve in the military. Quote, arguing that the war presented more opportunities than obstacles, Thomas Guglielmo reinforced the point that patriotic sacrifice and service only further fired Mexicans and Mexican Americans' determination to gain first-class citizenship. That's an awfully naive statement. If any of you have served in the military, you've had, relatives served in the military, that's, more opportunities than obstacles. I mean, I'm sorry, you can get killed. It's... Dave Gutierrez explains, though, an emphasis on World War II as sort of a civil rights epiphany obscures the political diversity within Mexican communities before Pearl Harbor and creates a fiction of unity where none existed. Now, I contend that at the level of the individual in the local community, World War II did signal a significant shift in social relations. Men in uniform challenged seating sections in town theaters, demanded service at whites-only restaurants, and desegregated public pools. Yet these protests did not occur in a vacuum, but drew strength from different political traditions within the Mexican-American community that I'm going to talk about, that these two groups that arose during the Depression. 1929, the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, and El Congreso de Pueblos de Habla Española, Spanish-speaking People's Congress. Founded by Tejanos in 1929, LULAC, within a decade, developed into a very influential Mexican-American middle-class civil rights organization with local councils across the Southwest. Now, they envisioned themselves as patriotic white Americans pursuing their rights. And LULAC restricted membership to English-speaking U.S. citizens. Now, as historian Dave Gutierrez notes, LULAC, taking a page from the early NAACP, stressed the leadership of an educated elite who would lift their less fortunate neighbors by their bootstraps. However, from 1929 through World War II, LULAC organized successful voter registration and poll tax drives and aggressively attacked discriminatory laws and practices. One could interpret LULAC's strategy or performance of whiteness as an organizational orchestration of passing. While Afro-Latinos confronted the color line in one way, fair-skinned Latinos could at times situate themselves quite differently. Light-complected Mexicans in Chicago, for example, could capitalize on their skin color to secure better jobs and mainstream social acceptance through acts of passing. Many of these Mexicans who could, quote, pass, tried to position themselves as Spanish. Indeed, in the 1930s, the idea is that you didn't say, oh, that's my Mexican friend. No, that's my Spanish friend. Okay, that sort of idea of Spanish for respect. In 1936, Blanca Rosa Rodriguez de Leon, a Guatemalan immigrant with a young daughter, could have passed, given her complexion, education, unaccented English, and elite background. However, this young radical labor organizer chose to forego any potential privileges based on race, class, and color. Deliberately distancing herself from the past, she chose the alias Moreno, or dark, as a surname, one diametrically opposed to her given name, Blanca Rosa, White Rose. For a first name, she selected Luisa, perhaps to honor Luisa Capetillo, who had preceded her in organizing cigar rollers in Florida 20 years before, and whose legacy, no doubt, she knew about and built upon. Luisa Moreno would become one of the most prominent women labor leaders in the United States, comparable in stature to Mother Jones, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and more recently Dolores Huerta. From the Great Depression to the Cold War, Moreno journeyed across the United States, mobilizing seamstresses in Spanish Harlem, cigar rollers in Florida, beat workers in Colorado, and cannery women in California. She's the first Latina to hold a national union office, and she was vice president, and this is a mouthful, the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, or UCAPAWA, in its heyday, the seventh largest CIO union. And she would later serve as the principal architect of El Congreso. On April 28th to 30th, 1939, the first National Civil Rights Assembly for U.S. Latinos was convened, El Congreso de Pueblos de Habla Española. Although the majority of the 1,000 to 1,500 delegates hailed from California and the Southwest, men and women traveled from as far away as Montana, Illinois, and Florida to attend the proceedings. Over 3 days, they drafted a comprehensive platform, bridging differences in generation and ethnic background. They called for an end to education, an end to segregation in public facilities, housing, education, and employment, and endorsed the rights of immigrants to live and work in the United States without fear of deportation. While encouraging immigrants to become citizens, delegates did not advocate assimilation, but emphasized the importance of preserving Latino cultures, calling upon universities to create departments in Latino studies. I mean, this is the first time that I found any mention to Latino studies. Despite the promise of the first convention, a national network of local affiliates never materialized, and only a few sort of very fragile Southern California chapters limped along during the war years. Now, the stands taken by Moreno and Congreso delegates must be placed within the milieu of the deportations and repatriations of the 1930s. Between 1931 and 1934, an estimated one-third of the Mexican population, approximately 500,000 people, were either deported or repatriated to Mexico, even though a majority, an estimated 60%, were native U.S. citizens, many children. Viewed as foreign usurpers of American jobs or as unworthy burdens on charity rolls, Mexicans were the only immigrants targeted for removal. They were either summarily deported by immigration agencies or persuaded to depart voluntarily by duplicitous social workers who greatly exaggerated the opportunities awaiting them south of the border. Thus, advocating for the rights of immigrants was a courageous course given this recent history. I mean, this is like 5 years from the deportations. They're taking this type of stand. Well, many scholars have profiled the possibilities for social change in the post-war era. The chill of the Cold War hastened the demise of 10 left-wing unions, Ucapawa among them, and the deportation of suspected immigrant radicals, Luis Moreno among them. LULAC and El Congreso would imprint different legacies, the former an institutional base, the latter an ideological ones. LULAC would continue to rely on the courts, the principal venue to redress discrimination, while El Congreso's platform would resonate decades later in the voices of Chicano activists in the 60s and 70s. Now I'm going to tell you about two California court cases, of course. Philippa Strum is the expert in Mendes versus Westminster, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about a case that I'm sure you've never heard of, that Perez versus Sharp. Mendes versus Westminster is 47, Perez versus Sharp is 1948. Both cases reveals the intersections of a Mexican-American civil rights with the larger African-American freedom movement, cases that foreshadowed the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education and Loving versus Virginia. In 1945, Gonzalo Mendes, a naturalized U.S. citizen born in Mexico, and his wife Felicitas, who was born in Puerto Rico, joined with 4 other families to sue 4 Orange County school districts. Aided in part by LULAC, they challenged the common practice of drawing school boundaries around Mexican neighborhoods to ensure de facto segregation. Indeed, in the minutes of a January 1945 Westminster school board meeting referred to the segregation with the oblique phrase, "The problem of the complaint from the Mexican-speaking peoples was discussed at length." The board, however, at this very same meeting, voted to admit to the white school Japanese-American children returning from internment. So it's a very contradictory meeting, very contradictory minutes. For Mexicans who lived in white residential areas, they too were subject to school segregation. Renowned California writer and commentator Carrie McWilliams noted an added precaution taken by school officials, placement based on phenotype. Quote, "Occasionally the school authorities inspect the children so that the offspring of a Mexican mother whose name may be O'Shaughnessy will not slip in the wrong school." So it didn't matter if you had an Anglo surname, you looked Mexican, you were Mexican. During the trial, superintendents reiterated well-worn stereotypes. Referring to Mexicans as a race, the Garden Grove superintendent flatly informed the court that Mexican children were inferior in terms of personal hygiene, scholastic ability, and economic outlook. The trope of the dirty Mexican appeared prominently throughout the proceedings. The plaintiff's attorney, David Marcus, questioned the constitutionality of educational segregation and called in expert witnesses who challenged the assumptions about Mexican-American children and the supposed need for separate schools. When she took the stand, Felicitas poignantly summed up her family struggles. "We always tell our children they are Americans." Taking almost a year to formulate his decision, Judge Paul McCormick in 1946 ruled that the segregation of Mexican youngsters found no justification in the laws of California, and furthermore was a clear denial of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. School districts appealed the decision. All of a sudden, civil rights organizations started to take notice. You know, this case is something that they might be able to take all the way. And so they began to file a number of amicus curiae briefs. It's LULAC, the American Jewish Congress, American Civil Liberties Union, the National Lawyers Guild, Japanese American Citizens League, and the NAACP. In 1947, the Ninth Circuit Court upheld McCormick's decision, and the Orange County School Board decided they'd rather desegregate than spend the money, because Orange County is notoriously cheap, to spend the money and take it to the Supreme Court. Now, Mendes versus Westminster assumes national significance through its tangible links to Brown versus Board in 5 areas. First of all, NAACP counsel Thurgood Marshall was directly involved in the case. His name appeared as a co-author of an amicus curiae brief. According to historian Ruben Flores at the University of Kansas, that the case, and we can discuss this, influenced a shift in NAACP legal strategy to include social science arguments. And Judge McCormick, in deliberating his decision, considered not only legal precedent, but also social science research. As Charles Wallenberg noted, much of the social and educational theory expressed by Judge McCormick anticipated Earl Warren's opinion in the historic Brown case. Fourth, it was the first time that a federal court had ruled that the segregation of Mexicans in public schools was a violation of state law and unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. Finally, as the direct result of the Mendes case, the California legislature passed the Anderson Bill, which repealed all California school codes mandating segregation, and it was signed into law by then-Governor Earl Warren. Now, this is a case you've probably never heard of. I think it's a fascinating case, and it certainly deserves more historical attention. The courtship of Andrea Perez and Sylvester Davis had all the makings of a 1940s Hollywood movie. Pretty Rosie the Riveter strikes up a friendship with her dashing co-worker. He goes off to fight for their country, and when he returns, they fall in love and plan to marry. Credits roll. Well, not quite. Perez was the daughter of Mexican immigrants, and had her fiancé, Sylvester Davis, was African-American. Fully aware that California's anti-miscegenation code prohibited their union, as Mexicans were legally classified as white, they hired civil rights attorney Dan Marshall after a Los Angeles County clerk denied the couple a marriage license. In 1948, the California Supreme Court ruled in Andrea Perez's favor, becoming the first state Supreme Court to strike down an anti-miscegenation law. It's interesting, they didn't make the case. Dan Marshall did not make the case on equal protection of 14th Amendment. Rather, he said this was a denial of freedom of religion. You know, they're Catholic, they want to get married, you're depriving them of freedom of religion. And the court didn't buy that, but they had another argument. As historian Dara Orenstein has argued, this decision hinged in part on mestizaje, that the court rendered the law as too vague and uncertain, given that it did not take into account people of mixed ancestry, and that government employees could not consistently determine degrees of whiteness. You know, you can't go around saying, well, that person's white, that person's not. And so it was sort of void for vagueness. In addition, Judge Roger Traynor, for the majority, ruled that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. At the time of the decision, Earl Warren was still governor of California. And 19 years later, he would provide as Chief Justice in Loving versus Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court case that struck down all remaining state anti-miscegenation laws. Scripting their own happily ever after, Sylvester Davis and Andrea Perez were married for over 50 years. That ended only with Perez's recent death from cancer. The year 1948 marked several events of significance to Latino history. Perez versus Sharp, the founding of the American GI Forum, and Commonwealth status for Puerto Rico. This period represented a claiming of public space as Latinos, through protest politics and popular culture, attempted to bridge the fault lines of inequality. The three defining moments that I've talked about today, 1848, 1898, and 1948, are suggestive of the way in which Latino history recasts and complicates constructions of empire and citizenship. Jose Marti dreamed of a new America, a trans-hemispheric union between North and South, rooted in democracy, dialogue, and equality. Quote, there can be no racial animosity, he wrote, because there are no races. The soul, equal and eternal, emanates from bodies of various shapes and colors. The racism and nativism which shaped Marti's world remain with us in the 21st century. And contrary to popular depictions of Latinos as people who arrived day before yesterday, there exists a rich layering of nationalities, generations, and experiences. Nuestra América es historia americana. Our America is American history. Gracias.
Thank you, Vicki. That was just absolutely splendid. Thank you so very much. All right, the floor is now going to be open for questions. This is, as I said earlier, being webcast, so will you please wait for the microphone to reach you so that the people who are watching this on their computer screens will be able to hear your question, and please identify yourself before you ask your question. Who would like to begin? You've stunned them.
Yes.
There is somebody in the back, please.
Henry Hedger, researcher at NARA. I've read the biography of Santa Anna several years ago, a new biography, and well, it indicated that in 1829, it had nothing to do with Santa Anna, but in that year, Mexico freed all their slaves.
Yes.
Some individual had seized control of Mexico, a revolutionist, and he became the president, and that was one of his first acts. And apparently it stayed on. I wondered, how did they handle this precisely? There was no real details in the book. Women were slaves, I guess, as well as men, and even children. And, well, you're interested in the ladies, and I wondered, how many were there? And of course, this impacted with Texas, and later it would help
Absolutely.
cause a war. So I wondered what your feelings were on this issue.
Well, by the time 1829 came around, actually, slavery was on the decline in Mexico. And the reason is that there was a way in which if you were a rich hacienda owner, you had lots of slaves, and you were dying, a way to get great indulgence to get into heaven is to manumit your slaves at your death. So this really, by 1829, slavery is really sort of on the decline because it's a way in which it's seen as this incredible act of charity, and also you're gaining points for heaven. There's a real great belief in the indulgences, and you would get a plenary indulgence, which meant if you grew up Catholic, plenary indulgence is like no matter what you did, it sort of erases it. So it's a way in which sort of, if, you're dying, well, you're going to hedge your bets, and there are these manumissions. Now, as you can imagine, yes, I mean, slaveholders in Texas were really upset about this. And this really begins to then be an incredible source of friction and conflict. And of course, the Mexican government couldn't enforce it in Texas. They couldn't enforce it. They were outnumbered, and they were didn't have the enforcement power. Also, they really didn't care that much about Texas, to be honest, at that point in time. You have to understand, in Mexico's first precarious years of existence, in the first 30 years, the presidency changed hands about 40 times. So there's so much instability that there wasn't that sort of, there was concern, but Santa Anna, when he came to power, was very concerned about Texas. And that's when tensions really began to escalate. Thank you.
Other questions? Please.
Yes.
Oh, we wait for the microphone. There's somebody up here.
I'm Denise Bear with Boston University, and I'm wondering, you described a number of women who were very good at, and very noteworthy in terms of labor union organizing, or were individual feminists. Was there an organized women's movement within the different Latina communities? And if so, could you describe, how they might have organized or worked to organize women?
Well, they were more like the women's club tradition, not a feminist movement, but a women's club tradition. There's a wonderful book that's coming out next year by Oxford University Press by Gabriela Gonzalez, who's this wonderful young historian who teaches UT San Antonio, and it's all about the sort of the transnational sort of women's clubs on the Texas-Mexico border, and how they change from sort of very groups being very focused on border issues and Mexican issues, and then become almost totally sort of like a U.S. women's club concerned with local communities. But in terms of a feminist organization, you're not going to see that until the early 1970s. You're not going to see it until Hijas de Guatemoc, which is the first sort of Chicana student feminist organization. And there's a new book out at UT Press by May Lee Blackwell. It's called Chicana Power, that talks about the Hijas. So there really isn't, in terms of what we would consider sort of organized feminism. There's women's and mutual benefit groups, but not articulating a feminist ideology.
Vicki, I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about Latino use of the political system in the early decades of the 20th century? To what extent were Latinos involved in electoral politics? If not, to what extent were they just being shoved away from electoral politics?
Oh, in New Mexico. I mean, if you want political clout, you have to look at New Mexico, because in New Mexico, they've always had sort of Hispanic representation in the legislature. In fact, this first Hispanic woman to run for Congress was in 1922, Adelina Otero Warren, who of course came from a fairly wealthy family, and she could have won too. She won the Republican primary, but her Democratic opponent, and it looked like, because New Mexico was fairly Republican, it looked like, that progressive, she's running on a progressive ticket, right? I've been the fair superintendent of the Santa Fe schools. I stand for good government, honesty, integrity. We're going to, clean out the, corruption in politics, and using this whole social housekeeping model. And she'd actually been involved in settlement work in New York. And so she basically came with that sort of consciousness. And her Democratic opponent, who was married and started, bringing his kids to events and using the family, because she posed herself that she was the widow of Ross and Warren. Unfortunately, her cousin, the former governor, Miguel Otero, decided basically that perhaps he was a bit jealous of his cousin's fame, and he let it slip that Adelina Otero Warren was not the widow of Ross and Warren. She was a divorcee. So even though they were divorced in 1906, it's still haunting her in 1922, and she basically very narrowly lost the election. And she never again sought public office, elected public office, although she was would continue to be appointed and be a really force in New Mexico education for most of her life. In California, you have a few of the old Californios, but very few who hold on as representative in the 1870s and 1880s. But they're not particularly sort of social conscious in terms of representing a Latino community. And so I think that's, in terms of sort of filing suits, you really begin to, where you really begin to see that is with LULAC. And they begin to be a real organized presence in terms of trying to use the court system. You also see it very early in 1931 in California with the Lemon Grove case, where it's very interesting. It's Mexican immigrants go to the Mexican Council for help to provide legal assistance for their U.S. children to attend the white school in a small community outside of San Diego, which is very interesting, is that they're usually, you would think of the Mexican Council helping immigrants, with problems in the home country, not really about, but if they wanted, and the council did, hired the legal talent to support the rights of their U.S.-born children.
Would you talk a little bit about the Lemon Grove case? Because it's fascinating.
Oh, Lemon Grove case, yes. 1931, there was a public school, and Mexicans and Anglos, everybody went to the same school. Everyone went to the same school. Well, they got a new superintendent and a new school board, and they decided that, the Mexicans needed to have their own school. So they built basically a ramshackle barn, put in old desks, old books, and according to the adults who were children at the time, the old teachers, and didn't tell the parents about it. Just one day, the kids came to show up and says, oh, no, you're going to that school. So the parents organized, and except for one family whose father worked for the Lemon Grove sort of city government, they kept their kids home, and they kept their kids home, and they kept their kids home, and they kept their kids home. And they filed suit. They went to the Mexican Council, they filed suit. And it's the first case where it's a very localized opinion, but the first case that said you can't segregate. And so the Mexican children got to go back. There's a wonderful documentary called The Lemon Grove Incident, and they interviewed at the time that was made Roberto Alvarez, who was the Alvarez versus Lemon Grove. He was the young boy that was the plaintiff. He says, we grew up speaking English, so when they got up and said, we had to have these schools because the kids don't speak English, I got up and took the stand. And he later would become actually very wealthy as a sort of brokering agricultural produce between the United States and Mexico. And his son, Roberto Alvarez, recently retired, professor of anthropology at the University of California, San Diego. And his grandson, Luis Alvarez, is currently an associate professor in history at the University of California, San Diego. It's a great story.
Other questions? Because if you don't have questions, I'm going to go on asking Vicki questions. Yes, please. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Ann Stone with the National Women's History Museum. Two questions. One, talking about the labor movement and some of the others. What about Latino women involved in entrepreneurial activity and business? Were there any organized business groups in the Latina world? And a second part, totally unrelated, I've done a lot of work in Central America and the Caribbean, and I know we ran into still a caste system between the different ethnic backgrounds within the Latina community. Does that still exist, and is there any hope of ever getting rid of that?
I think it's less caste. I think that there's more of there are regional differences, and I know a lot of Latino groups, for example, you get together and they feel, oh, it's just the Chicano, Mexicana, it's just Mexican Americans, and, our stories aren't getting heard. And there is certainly the importance of trying to I'm hoping, bring more people together. There's less sort of, I would argue, nationalist feelings than before. I think there's becoming much more of people talking across disciplines. There's still class differences. Absolutely. Absolutely. In terms of entrepreneurs, women have been often survive on the basis of their entrepreneurship in the communities. They make food. Like African American women, they make food, they sell food, they open small stores. They're healers, they're local healers. They're involved in the informal economy, and some become successful with their sort of restaurants and clothing shops and other forms. I'm thinking probably the most successful entrepreneur that we know about historically is Latules, who was a saloon keeper in Santa Fe, New Mexico, who basically in the midst of after the U.S.-Mexico War, she's actually making a lot of money as she's having U.S. soldiers and merchants and newcomers dump money on her gambling tables. Yes.
Hi, Susan Scanlon.
Hi.
Wearing another hat, I run a Women in the Military project, and we've always seen the military as a way of climbing up the social network. I thought you might be interested to know, or probably you already do know, that the #1 demographic for recruitment for the Marines is Latinas.
Really?
Yeah, they're following their fathers and brothers in. And I'm just wondering if you could give me a comment on why you think that is happening. It's,
I think maybe it's
unusual.
more acceptable for the young women to go into the military than before. I know for my generation, if I had said I wanted to go in the military, my parents would have sent me to some Catholic girls' school. No. So I think it's certainly much more acceptable. It's also a way in which people, working class kids go in the military to get money for college. They go for training. I think that's has been a sort of a historic path for mobility, and it's also a great deal of pride too. Absolutely, a great deal of pride. Yes.
There's a gentleman over here.
Hi, Elliot Young, Lewis and Clark College in Portland.
Oh, great.
So I was interested in the title of the talk, Why Latina History Matters to U.S. History, and in your talk, the invocation of Jose Marti and sort of situating him as a Latino, where really he lives his whole adult life outside of Cuba. And so I was wondering how you would situate, or whether you think, how you think Latina history matters to Latin American history, and you're also invoking this idea of a broader hemispheric history.
Absolutely. I think we have to move in that direction and look at the transnational connections. I'm stepping down as dean at the end of August, so I can go back to being a regular faculty member and finish a biography of Luisa Moreno that I have began a very long time ago. And her transnational connections remain. She is found out recently that the leader of the Guatemalan feminist movement in the 30s and 40s is her sister. Okay? Her sister Graciela. There is this sort of back and forth. Moreno's involved in Mexico during the Cultural Renaissance. She hung out with Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. She published a book of poetry. And so she's maintaining connections with Mexico. She's retaining some connections from Guatemala, so that when she's deported in 50 back to her native Guatemala, it's not like she just sort of goes back and nobody knows her. I mean, she's maintained these kind of connections. And so I would look at the way in which I think it's important that, first of all, Latin American historians and U.S. historians really need to talk to each other. And, you know, look at the ways, and this is actually how I found out, was from a Latin American historian, that of this connection between Graciela Mato Rodriguez and Luisa Moreno was through these discussions. I think we have to look at the ways in which, particularly for contemporary Mexican history, the impact of remittances and the way in which what is happening now, that because of the militarization of the border, you don't have sort of the ebb and flow that you once had between groups who, you know, individuals who make their living in the United States but have this idea of sort of returning home and periodically return home. It's become increasingly difficult to maintain those connections. Although with cell phone technology and the internet, I mean, you can go to a lot of the pueblitos and they have connections with their family. You have to look at, for example, and it still is a fraught relationship between Cuban Americans and Cuba. You know, some of the younger generation is saying, "Oh yes, let's open ties. I want to go back," and others who are just like, you know, no, this is not happening. You see it also the Dominicans, and also certainly the Puerto Ricans. The Puerto Ricans have a great deal of sort of transnational, a lot of movement back and forth. It's a wonderful book by anthropologist Gina Perez called The Near Northwest Side, which is about Chicago, and it talks about how when things get too tough in Chicago, you go to the island. You got a kid who's acting up, you send him to the island, or her to the island, and the way in which jobs are opening up, and then you go back. And talking about how the cultural codes are different. For example, how a woman acts in Chicago and not the way she's going to act when she returns to see family in Puerto Rico, and the cultural codes. I mean, I think we need that much more of that kind of scholarship to look at that sort of diasporic transnational movement. Thank you.
There's a question in the
Yes.
back.
Yes.
Do you want to wait for the microphone, please? Will you just wait a minute? Thanks.
You did mention, or I'm a little bit not good of hearing, so anything about the women in the arts and in the letters?
I really didn't talk about, and, you know, there's so much I really didn't talk about
de la
that.
Cruz,
Mm-hmm.
and poets and very outstanding women in Puerto Rico in the literature field.
Yeah. In the talk, I can only do so much, and so what I wanted to do is sort of give a very political orientation. Certainly, there's like Julia Burgos. There's some just, you know, wonderful women writers, intellectuals, actors you never hear about, or you do, Rita Moreno, but there were just a whole, you know, legion before. Most of my work is focused on sort of Latinos in the mainland, and less on Puerto Rico. I will admit, my colleague, my intellectual comadre is Virginia Sanchez Coral, and she was the first Puerto Rican woman to get a PhD in a U.S. institution on the mainland U.S. institution at SUNY Stony Brook. And I think that you know, we need more in the arts and literature. I mean, we don't get enough attention. There's not a lot of literary history in terms of what's published in English in the United States. I mean, Luisa Capetillo's 1911 Feminist Manifesto just appeared in English, so for the first time I can really assign it in classes. She's really interesting because she's an organic intellectual. She's someone who came from very working class roots, whose parents loved books and infused her love of books. And it's very different. Right now I'm writing a paper, I'm comparing her and Luisa Moreno as young women, and they're developing feminist consciousness. And whereas Moreno, as a young girl, are talking about all these sort of great works and talking about sort of women in a Republican motherhood setting. Luisa Capetillo's talking about that too, but she's also talking about socialism and workers' rights. And she's also quoting, it's interesting though, they're quoting the same group of Latin American feminists, particularly in Argentina and Chile at the time, that are very active during that time. But we need to know more about women as writers, as artists, as intellectuals. We're just, I think, beginning to sort of have the surface of that.
One of the reasons one doesn't know more about women, I think, Latino women, was brought home to me when I was looking at this Mendes case. And as you said, there are 5 families involved in the case. If you look at the court filings, you discover that the only people, the cases had to be brought by the parents on behalf of their children. The only people who were mentioned, the only adults who were mentioned in the court filings are the fathers, because it was assumed that, of course, they were the only important people. So you will see that the fathers were the plaintiffs. The mothers weren't involved. In fact, the lead family, the Mendes family, at this point was running a farm in your Orange County, and because the father was indeed spending all of his time on this case, the mother took over the running of this substantial farm, and not only did that, but put together an organization of people to support the case, went from district to district in Orange County, also organized a movement to go door to door to get $1 at a time to support the costs of the case. But she's not there because she's a woman. It's the guys who brought the case. It was the male lawyer who argued the case, and it was a male lawyer on the other side who argued for the county. It was the male judge who handed down the decision. And when the case was appealed to the higher court, it was the male judges of the Federal Court of Appeals who rendered the decision. And if you look at the names on the briefs of the organizations that came in as amicus, like the Japanese American Citizens League or the NAACP, whatever, it's all guys.
It's all guys.
So writing women back into history becomes a real challenge. And of course, it's no small contributing factor that until relatively recently, the overwhelming majority of historians were men.
Well, it's just, the Mendes case is really interesting because I have these wonderful pictures. Oh, thank you. I'm just about ready to go over and get my briefcase. I think that the Mendes case is interesting because I've seen these incredible pictures of LULAC holding fundraisers for the Mendes case. And to me, it's like an epitome of sort of Americanization and what they're striving for. They have a raffle. And you know what they're raffling off and selling, and all the proceeds are going to go for the Mendes case? A shiny new refrigerator. And they shows the picture of the raffle, and they're showing the LULAC queen, who is the most fair-skinned Latina I have ever seen. I mean, she could be on Telemundo in one of the novellas. I mean, really, that light. You know, picking out the lucky winner. But I thought it was interesting because they had this new refrigerator draped in the American flag. So they have all this sort of iconography and symbolism in this one photograph about sort of what they're striving for and how they see sort of this intricate relationship between citizenship and consumption.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I just want to emphasize something that Vicki said, not only because I love this case so much, but because I think it's really important to this business of why Latina history matters. We all know about Brown versus Board of Education. And I think it's really important to emphasize that 8 years before Brown versus Board of Education, 8 years before Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP thought that they could take a chance of bringing a case to the Supreme Court challenging separate but equal. 8 years before that, it was Mexican Americans who went into court, challenged separate but equal, won, And as you said, Earl Warren is the key figure between these two cases. Earl Warren, sitting in Sacramento when the Mendes decision was handed down, goes to the state legislature and says, hey, we've got a law in the books in California that specifically says you can segregate Indian kids and you can segregate Asian kids. But here the court has just told us you're not supposed to segregate Mexican-American kids. Maybe we should get rid of segregation in California. And, of course, the legislature goes along with that, and the law is revoked. Okay, so who is it that later turns the Supreme Court around and says, okay, maybe segregation in the schools is wrong? More than this, the person who, more than anybody else, was responsible for the NAACP's amicus brief in the Mendes case was a guy named Robert Carter, who was the second in command at the NAACP. And in fact, when the case was underway, Thurgood Marshall, who had been quite ill, was recuperating in the West Indies. So Robert Carter was running the NAACP's office. And Robert Carter, who had always wanted to use social science evidence to show that segregation leads to a feeling of inferiority, which impedes the ability to learn, said, hey, this is my chance. I'm going to get into the Mendes case and with all of the social science stuff. And Robert Carter, who later became a federal court judge in New York and who happily is still with us today, has said over and over again that the brief he wrote in the Mendes case was his trial run for Brown versus Board of Education. So when we think of the civil rights movement in the United States, and we think of this as basically African American with all the other ethnic groups jumping in after African Americans had won the important victories, it's not quite like that at all. Mexican Americans brought a case that was decided 2 weeks before Brown versus Board by the Supreme Court of the United States, which specifically said, a case of Hernandez versus Texas, specifically said that you could not segregate Mexican Americans, that discrimination against Mexican Americans was a violation of the 14th Amendment. And then 2 weeks later, it hands down Brown versus Board of Education. So if you're looking at my field, which is legal history, you can scarcely not ignore the importance of Latinos in our history, which is rather wonderful. Okay, well, on that note, I think it is time for us to have some food for the stomach as well as food for the intellect. And we're going to ask you to join us outside for a little wine and cheese reception, but please.